bit more diverse. Yeah, in Israel we have debates on debates on debates. That's kind of how we operate. So, kind of like to debate, I guess. But the bottom line is that the way I see it is, and this is again partially relating to current research as well, and that is the notion of relying upon the existing infrastructure of cultural heritage and the different instruments and means by which that are out there for protection of cultural heritage, be it, for example, through UNESCO and the attendant instruments like the World Heritage Convention, are kind of problematic in a general sense, and then I'll refer to what Peter's referring to in the more specific sense with regard to Israel itself, or at least use the Israeli context as kind of an example of these different things. And that is, and in a way it relates to what happened literally not but 3 weeks ago with the vote in UNESCO with regard to the various sites and the Western Wall itself, the attempt by UNESCO to declare the Western Wall a non-Jewish site, and the declaration of the Marat Machpelah, the cave and grave of the patriarchs and matriarchs that are holy certainly to Islam and to Judaism, as well as Kever Rachel, which is the grave of Rachel, who is a matriarch who was not buried in Hebron, but outside, closer to Beit Lechem, to Bethlehem. In any case, and there it was an attempt it was a highly politicized attempt to sort of usurp the role, any Jewish role in these sites. And it didn't necessarily come out that way, thankfully. I think thanks to the executive director of UNESCO. But still, it's indicative of an inherent problem when dealing in a generalized, if you will, a broader sense of international approaches towards holy sites or holy places or sacred places. And that is, of course, the politicization of these areas. The overall general problem with many of the instruments, particularly with the World Heritage Convention, is that it's Eurocentric, and I'm sure you've heard a lot of these things before. World Heritage Convention seems to be beset by institutional fatigue, if you ask me. Highly sought after nationalists and national agendas, less experts and more diplomats is what's really happening. Seems to be what's happening in these international organizations like WHO, the World Heritage Convention. UNESCO, as I said, in my eyes, and this is something that I guess is an Israeli, I've seen already since the early 1970s as being a highly politicized organization. And it's not to belittle or to demean or even to remove aspects of politics from these issues, because they're there. And I don't want to stick my head in the sand like an ostrich and say that, oh no, we're not going to deal with politics in these issues. Of course we should. But what I am saying is that to take it on the other side is to think about, well, what does that mean, similar to the opening remarks, what does that mean with regard to management of these sites? What does that mean with regard to individuals who might want to lay a claim to these particular sites? And how should we go about providing for some form of protection? Holy places also, and sacred sites in particular, are particularist. They're oriented towards particular groups. And therefore, I know Peter has a super article in a Silvio Ferrari book about looking at soft law as an avenue for allowing for some type of protection for holy places. But to look at international instruments like UNESCO or international bodies like UNESCO or international instruments like the World Heritage Convention, well, these are really universalist type of approaches. World heritage of mankind, and again, it's not to denigrate or belittle that importance of looking at cultural heritage from a universalist perspective, but it does not address the needs and issues that are arising in many of the, particularly with regard to holy places, as forms of or as adjuncts of forms of culture, aspects of cultural heritage. And even when you take it into the sustainability context, which is kind of the focus of this particular conference, it seems to me this should be a greater push towards listening to less politics and more adherence or listening, putting the ear to the ground to listen to religious groups that are involved in these particular issues, i.e. not necessarily the states as such. Search for Common Ground, for example, is issuing a number of different codes of conduct, so to speak, with regard to how to deal with holy places. And it really is asserting the idea of grassroots, local involvement, things that we're all probably familiar with, but are many times are lost in these international instruments. And just to bring it into what Peter wanted me to focus on, which is, for example, Temple Mount or Har Zion, Mount Zion, which has many issues now with regard to particularly with regard to the cenacle. So, if you think about the Temple Mount itself, for example, and the old city of Jerusalem, the walls of the old city as a protected World Heritage Convention site. So, you know, in the international sense, that's really nice, very cosmopolitan, you know, cosmopolitan approach. It was discussed earlier this morning with regard to approach to religion. But by the same token, there is a strong need for particularism. There's a strong need for listening to what are the groups really saying, what's really happening, particularly with regard to the Temple Mount. And in a way, it's you know, cultural heritage, in a way, is, because of this sustainability, it's linked to environmental protection because it emerged at the same time as this idea of sustainable development in the early 70s. Well, guess what? That's when cultural heritage protection really started to hit the ground running and becoming some type of concept. But that kind of skewers the idea of what cultural heritage protection is all about. It kind of removes a lot of the actors that are important. What I'm thinking of is, for example, with regard to the Temple Mount, is kind of two different avenues that I think can assist here, possibly. One is a movement that's been emerging over the past, let's call it 5 to 7 years, and that's the idea of socialization of human rights. And that's looking at human rights, and again, of course, I'm going to take a human rights approach. It's kind of my field as well. But it's looking at human rights from the idea of how can we inculcate human rights into different societies, almost in a way addressing the cultural relativism argument by looking at acculturation, by looking at means in which states and other actors can allow for the integration of human rights principles, which would in turn assist in addressing issues that are arising with regard to flaring up points, what do you call them, conflagrations like the Temple Mount. The other is to look at changing aspects of what we call manifestation in the context of the various human rights treaties, particularly with regard to freedom of religion and conscience or conscientious belief. And that is, what seems to be emerging is a different notion of what manifestation of belief, I shouldn't say what it means, that's probably incorrect, but what the treaty means with regard to manifestation. And I think that could be an avenue. I personally think that might be an avenue for allowing for recognition of groups that are involved or that's important to them in different holy places, that they're not necessarily be set to these international instruments that are state-centric and that really don't offer many solutions at the end of the day. I'm really sorry to say that. But if you look at the World Heritage Convention, you look at UNESCO conventions, even if you look at the various treaties, even treaty to protect cultural heritage during time of warfare, they're kind of there's not much water in them at the end of the day. They're nice vessels, but they're not really holding much. And because they're state-centric and because they don't allow for any type of protection as such, then it's so deferential to the states that the groups themselves that are interested and oriented towards these sites that are important to them are just not being listened to, or at least not being part of the discussion. So what I'm saying is that another avenue might be is utilizing the existing instruments that are there for protecting freedom of religion and conscientious belief, i.e. Article 9 of the European Convention, International Common Civil Political Rights, Article 18, and sort of trying to look at ways in which manifestation has been shifting to allow for broader action, to allow for more group orientation. It's not such an individual right anymore. And it's recognizing there's no doubt in European Convention jurisprudence. Again, this was mentioned earlier this morning about the Evida case. There's no doubt that what's happening is that the courts are beginning to recognize that this manifestation is not just linked to what does the belief say, but it's actually linked to more of what's the nexus, what's the connection between the act that's being asserted and the belief itself. Which is widening, in my eyes, of what manifestation means, and that could be an avenue, I think, at least as part of a discussion for allowing for some type of a greater protection for holy places.